Hi and welcome. This week I'm taking a look at the Royal Enfield Classic 500. Now this particular one is in the Desert Storm colour scheme. There's a few models in the range, but I chose this one because it's sort of very reminiscent of those dispatch bikes that were ridden in the Second World War in the desert. And the colour scheme I found was quite appealing. Now the main difference between this model and their standard Bullet 500, apart from the paint scheme and a few little details, is the fact that it's fitted with a single seat rather than the dual saddle. And the single seat actually is also a sprung saddle, so it really gives you that classic 1940s look. Though if you looked at this motorcycle alongside a period Royal Enfield of that era, you would of course find that they are completely different in that respect. Now my first impressions on riding the motorcycle was that there was a fair bit of vibration, but there are certainly ways to minimise that, and I was probably riding it not quite in the right manner to begin with. But I'll get onto that a little bit later. Handling wise, the motorcycle certainly does have fairly slow steering, which is certainly period correct for a classic motorcycle. It's quite slow to initiate turns, but just requires a bit of counter steering on the bars. But apart from that, the handling of the motorcycle is really quite confidence inspiring. Part of the reason why the steering is slow is that it has fairly large wheels at both ends. We've got a 19-inch wheel on the front, which is a steel rim laced spoked wheel, and we have an 18 at the back. And again, that is sort of like a period correct wheel combination from the 50s and 60s, and it certainly probably aids in that slightly slower steering. Now suspension wise, we've got conventional forks on the front, which are 35mm. They're non-adjustable and have around 130mm of travel. Now on our B-grade roads, I found the front suspension was just spot on. It certainly was well damped and well sprung, and it showed no signs of hopping or skipping or wallowing at any point during my test ride, and I went over some pretty poor roads. But then again, you've got to realise that there are some performance limitations to this motorcycle, so you're not really stressing the suspension too much. Now the rear is fitted with twin gas charge shocks, which are adjustable for preload only. Now they only have around 80mm of travel, and I did find on the current settings, which are the factory settings, that the rear was probably just a little bit firm for me, but they are set one notch up, so you can probably soften that off a little bit. But in saying that, the bike was not uncomfortable. Combined with the sprung saddle, I had no issues with the comfort of this motorcycle. It was a real pleasure to ride. Now braking wise, we've got a 280mm disc on the front, which is fitted with a 2-piston caliper. Now the front brake is more than adequate for the performance of this motorcycle, and certainly would pull this motorcycle up quite smartly with a little bit more than what the lever pressure than you would require on your average Japanese motorcycle. It requires a fairly firm pressure, but then this bike isn't fitted with anti-lock braking, so that's probably a good thing, though I do believe that Royal Enfield are going to include anti-lock braking on a range of their models in coming years. Now the rear brake is a 153mm drum brake, and whilst it did require a fair bit of lever travel of the foot lever to operate it, the rear brake did seem fairly progressive and showed no signs of wanting to lock up, though it may have a tendency to do that if the conditions were a little bit damp or wet. So you probably need to be a little bit careful with the rear brake when you're doing a fairly heavy braking, particularly in the wet weather. Now the engine is, I guess, the standout feature of this motorcycle. Now Royal Enfield in England produced their first motorcycle in around 1901. And the first motorcycle to be produced in India was produced in around 1955, when Royal Enfield set up a factory in India to produce motorcycles for the Indian Army. Now those Enfield bullets were used for probably close to 30 years in India. They were sold domestically as well as sold to the Indian Army, and because there were fairly high tariffs, they didn't change that much. They didn't need to change to survive as the rest of the world progressed. So India was effectively selling and riding a piece of history, you might say, for many years. And it wasn't really until the late 90s that Enfield realised that to increase their sales to the outside world, they had to meet emission standards, and they also needed to do things like move the gear change lever from the right side to the left side, which is now common practice. The earlier Enfields, of course, had the gear change lever on the right-hand side, like all the British bikes did of the 30s, 40s, 50s and 60s. So with that in mind, Enfield developed their unit construction engine. Before that, the engine and gearbox were two separate items, and that engine design hadn't really changed much, as I said, for 30 years. They made a few updates to the engine. When they unitised it, they gave it a 5-speed gearbox, and they moved the gear change to the left-hand side in line with Japanese and European motorcycles. Now that engine is still technically a long-stroke engine, though it's close to square. It's push rod, it has 2 valves per cylinder, and runs, as I said, a 5-speed gearbox. Now the engine is fitted with fuel injection, which certainly makes living with this motorcycle a lot easier. There's a fast idle lever on the handlebar, which you put into the fast idle position when you start it from cold, but the engine warmed up fairly quickly. It is a warm day today, so I can't say what it'll be like in cold weather, but there was certainly no fluffing or hiccups, and the fuel injection was really quite smooth and progressive in operation on this motorcycle. Now the characteristics of that engine are definitely old school. You have to resist your temptation to rev this engine because all you're going to get is vibration. It really loves being lugged at a much lower RPM. I found that at cruising speeds of between 80 and 100 kilometers per hour in top gear, you would find that there's minimal vibration at 80 kilometers per hour and just a little bit more at 100. You really don't want to do those speeds in fourth. Fifth is definitely the go, and you'll find there is plenty of torque there when you open the throttle to overtake or to go up hills. I mean, it doesn't have the performance of a Japanese motorcycle, but that's not what this motorcycle is about. Around town, I'd say this is an okay bike to commute on, but where this motorcycle really shines is on B-grade roads sitting between 80 and 100 kilometers per hour. I mean, I found I really wanted to sit on those sort of speeds on nice country roads and just cruise. I mean, this is a completely different motorcycle to my Benelli, and you know, you get a completely different feeling on this motorcycle. You almost need to think of it, this is more like meditation on a motorcycle in some respects. To me, that's what encapsulates what the feeling of this motorcycle was for me. I felt like I was meditating. It's relaxing and a real pleasure to ride on long sweepers and through twisty corners, just sitting on the torque curve between 80 and 100 kilometers per hour. And at the end of the journey, you feel relaxed. You know, by the time you get to your cafe or the pub for lunch, you are really feeling as though you've enjoyed yourself and you're ready for a nice cup of coffee before continuing on with your journey. Now the fit and finish of the bike, the paintwork is quite nice. This one's done in a sort of a desert sand colour. It's a matte finish, and it's certainly nicely done. The switch gear is your typical Japanese or European sort of switch gear. It's good quality, it's not outstanding, there's nothing special about it, but it's not disappointing either. Oh, and I should also mention that the controls are fairly light. The bike changes gear easily, the clutch is light, though I did find that the gear change lever was not quite at the right height for my motorcycle boots. It just sits a little low, so it can be hard to get your boot under. The lever needs, in my opinion, to sit up a little bit higher or perhaps be a little bit longer. So who is this motorcycle aimed for? Well, I guess it's aimed at someone who's looking for a classic motorcycle, who would like to relive the riding experiences of the 40s, 50s and 60s, and it certainly does that in spades and makes it a little less troublesome in that you've got the fuel injection, you've got modern brakes, but it's certainly got a lot of the character of those early motorcycles. As I said before, it really shines on country cruising. You know, on roads, B-grade roads in particular, where you're going between 80 and 100 kilometers per hour, the suspension's more than adequate and quite good on those sorts of roads, and you can really enjoy that cruising experience. Could you use it as a commuter? Certainly, but it's not that sort of a motorcycle really. It's not really a commuter. It'd be good for cafe culture if you want to zip down to cafes on the weekend and enjoy a ride along the beach. Certainly, it's got the street cred, it's got a lot going for it. People certainly look at this motorcycle. It looks like something straight out of the 50s and 60s, and you certainly get a lot of envious looks for it. And it's that sort of bike. Now the learner, should a learner motorcyclist get it? In some ways, yes, in some ways, no. Because this requires quite a different style of riding, particularly in the engine department with its low revving engine, you'd probably find it's probably not a great choice for a learner motorcyclist. For the simple fact that if you're going to be moving up onto a Japanese or Italian machine after this, you'll find the transition a little bit more difficult. But certainly it's a non-threatening motorcycle to ride, and a learner could certainly learn to ride on this motorcycle. But as I said, that transition onto a more mainstream motorcycle, they'd probably find a little bit more difficult after having ridden this motorcycle. Price-wise in Australia, it comes in just under $9,000 on the road, and that is a fairly expensive price in this market segment, I think you'll find. So I think Royal Enfield have their work cut out for them to have many sales of this motorcycle in Australia, because it's not going to be bought as an economic alternative. You're really buying it because you want that classic style and that classic riding experience, which is much more of a niche market than people who are purchasing a motorcycle for, in this market segment in particular, size-wise. They're looking for a cost-effective commuter, daily ride, something to also do weekend rides and a little bit of touring perhaps. But I think it's going to be a bit of a hard sell for Royal Enfield to pull that off in Australia. But in saying that, I personally found this a really enjoyable riding experience myself, particularly country cruising. It's sort of really where this worked for me. Before I go, I'd like to thank A1 Motorcycles in Ringwood, Victoria, for loaning me the Royal Enfield Classic 500, in this case the one in the Desert Storm colour scheme. And you'll find their contact details in the description below. I'll catch you next time.